Michael had always prided himself on the simplicity of his life. It wasn't that he didn't enjoy the occasional excitement, but there was something profoundly satisfying about the quiet rhythms of his days. He woke up at 6:30 a.m. every weekday. The soft beeping of his phone alarm, the only sound breaking through the stillness of his small apartment in Denver. The morning light filtered gently through the blinds, casting pale lines across the floor. He always liked to get up before the city had fully come to life. There was something peaceful about those early moments, when the world was still wrapped in the quiet haze of the dawn. The first thing he did was make coffee. He wasn't one for fancy gadgets or elaborate routines, just a simple drip coffee maker, the familiar smell of the beans grinding as the hot water trickled through. The sound of the coffee brewing filled the otherwise silent apartment, creating a comforting soundtrack for the first few minutes of the day. Michael poured his coffee into his favorite mug, a plain white ceramic one that had a chip on the rim from years of use. It was a small, insignificant thing, but it always felt like home, the same as the worn sofa cushions he sank into as he took his first sip of the morning. The apartment wasn't much one bedroom, a small kitchen, a living room with a single window that faced the street, but it was his. He had moved to Denver 2 years ago, looking for a fresh start, and the place felt like a refuge. He wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a quiet space where he could unwind after a long day of work. The walls were bare except for a few photographs, his favorite being one from a trip to the mountains that he and a few friends had taken the year before. It was an unremarkable scene, just a lake, some trees, the sun sinking low behind the peaks, but it reminded him of those days when everything seemed possible, when life felt open, unscripted. Michael worked from home, which suited him just fine. As a freelance graphic designer, he had the luxury of creating his own schedule. Some days, his workday would start early and end late, while on others, he would take breaks throughout the day to clear his head, walk around the block, or catch up on a book. There was a simplicity to it that he found satisfying. No commutes, no office politics, just him, his laptop, and the quiet hum of his apartment. The mornings were spent working on design briefs, the afternoons spent refining images, tweaking color palettes, adjusting layouts. Sometimes, the work would come easily, and the hours would pass without him even noticing. Other times, he would find himself staring at the screen, waiting for inspiration to strike. But either way, there was no rush, no one to answer to but himself. It was a peaceful life, and Michael had always thought it would stay that way. He liked the solitude, the stillness of his apartment. The walls were thick enough that the sounds of the city outside, cars passing, the occasional chatter from the neighbors, never reached him too strongly. The neighbors on his floor were quiet, respectful, and didn't make much noise. There were no parties, no loud music, no arguments through the thin walls. The only time he saw them was when they passed each other in the hallway, exchanging polite nods or casual hellos. He never had much to do with them, and he liked it that way. His life was contained within these four walls, and he preferred it that way. The simplicity of it all suited him. Evenings were his favorite time of day. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the apartment became softer, warmer, and more intimate. He would close his laptop and take a break, stretch his legs, and grab something for dinner. Usually, it was something quick: pasta, a sandwich, sometimes just leftovers from earlier in the week. He didn't mind eating alone. It gave him time to unwind, reflect on his day, and mentally prepare for the next. His evenings weren't filled with social engagements or long nights out. He wasn't antisocial, but he didn't feel the need to constantly be around people. Instead, he would sit on the couch, watching the news or an old movie, sipping his second cup of coffee or maybe a beer. It was quiet, comfortable. He liked the feeling of being in control of his time, of deciding how the hours passed without pressure or expectation. Michael's life had always felt like a series of small, predictable moments, and he had always been content with that. His routine was like a well-worn path through the woods, familiar and safe. He didn't expect anything dramatic to disrupt it. There were no surprises, no unexpected changes, no disruptions. Everything was in its place. Everything made sense. At night, before bed, Michael would sometimes sit at the kitchen table and read. The kitchen was small, with only a few cabinets and a modest refrigerator, but it was functional. He liked to sit there in the evening, with the soft glow of the overhead light reflecting off the white tiles. He'd flip through a book or scroll through his phone, catching up on the day's news or checking in with friends online. He wasn't one for deep, philosophical musings, but he enjoyed the comfort of knowing what to expect. Life was simple. There was no need for drama. He was happy with his routine. It wasn't that he feared change, it was just that he liked things the way they were. He didn't need excitement or unpredictability to feel alive. The quiet, the stillness, the routine, they gave him a sense of peace that he cherished. He liked knowing that he had control over his space, his schedule, his life. It was the kind of life that allowed him to be at ease. And that was enough. But as the days passed and the small things started to feel less like coincidences and more like signs of something deeper, Michael began to feel the edges of that peace begin to fray. At first, he told himself he was overreacting. Everyone has those moments where they think they've misplaced something, or they forget where they put their keys. He had always been a little forgetful, a little distracted. But after the fourth or fifth time something was out of place, the feeling began to settle in, nagging at the back of his mind like a small, persistent itch. Something wasn't right. The little changes, the subtle shifts felt like they were adding up. But what did it mean? And more importantly, who was causing it? The more Michael thought about it, the less it seemed like a simple coincidence. The peaceful life he had once taken for granted, the life that had seemed so stable, now felt like it was built on a foundation that was beginning to crack. He wasn't sure when it started, whether it was last week or a few months ago, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Someone was getting into his apartment when he wasn't there. And now, the question was, how long had it been going on? Michael sat on his couch one evening, staring blankly at the television, though the screen wasn't really registering in his mind. The room felt unusually quiet, even though the soft hum of the fridge and the sound of passing cars outside should have provided some level of background noise. It was the kind of stillness that seemed to stretch out far beyond its natural bounds, making everything feel more tense than it should have been. He had grown accustomed to the comfortable quiet of his apartment, but tonight the silence was unsettling. His eyes drifted to the hallway, and for a moment he caught himself holding his breath. The door was shut, just as it always was when he came home, but tonight it felt different. He couldn't explain why. It was a quiet thought that had been creeping up on him for the last few days, settling into the corners of his mind like a shadow. Something wasn't right. He wasn't sure how or when it started. It was as though a shift had occurred, a subtle, imperceptible change. It had been happening for a while, but only now, when he truly focused, did he realize that he had been noticing things out of place for weeks. He tried to shake the thought, tried to distract himself, but it was like a nagging itch at the back of his mind. Small things, little anomalies had been building up, piling on top of each other in ways that didn't quite make sense. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but each incident seemed like a small piece of a larger puzzle. The first time he'd noticed something strange, he chalked it up to forgetfulness. He had come home one evening to find his kitchen knife not where he'd left it. It wasn't much, just a slight deviation, but it had caught his attention. Maybe he had simply moved it, or maybe the fridge had been open longer than he remembered. But then the next day, His wallet was in a different spot on the counter. And the day after that, his keys were missing from their usual place on the hallway hook. The small discrepancies began to grow. He would return to his apartment to find something had shifted in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. A book that had been on his coffee table would be moved slightly, as if someone had flipped through it. His jacket, which he always hung in the same spot by the door, would sometimes be draped over the chair in the living room. The items weren't missing. They were just out of place, subtly moved from where he had left them. Each time he would dismiss it, tell himself that he had just been careless or perhaps distracted by work. But the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. He was meticulous by nature, and the thought that he was misplacing things this frequently didn't sit well with him. He began to pay more attention to the little details, where he left things, what had changed, and when it happened. And as he did, the uncomfortable feeling of unease began to creep deeper into his mind. His apartment, the one place he had always considered a refuge, was starting to feel like a place that wasn't his anymore. The small shifts in his belongings were not just inconvenient, they were unsettling. It felt like someone was in his space, touching his things without his permission, without any indication that they had been there. One day, as he arrived home from work, he noticed the door to his apartment was slightly ajar. It wasn't wide open, but just enough for him to know something was wrong. The doorknob turned easily when he twisted it, and the door clicked open with a soft creak. His heart skipped a beat. It was the kind of thing that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He was certain he had locked the door when he left that morning. He always did. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking into the quiet apartment, his mind racing through all sorts of possible explanations, none of which felt plausible. Maybe the wind had caught it. Maybe it hadn't latched properly when he left. But as he stepped inside, the smell of his apartment, the smell of his own space felt different. He couldn't explain it, but it was there. The air felt thicker, as though someone had been in here. Moving through the rooms, he stepped further into the apartment, scanning the room for anything out of place. The furniture was where it should be, the books on the shelf arranged neatly. But as he walked past the kitchen, he noticed something. A small mark on the countertop, an indentation that wasn't there earlier. It was hard to tell, but it looked like something had been moved, something he hadn't noticed until now. His mind raced as he tried to think back, trying to recall what could have caused it. But nothing came to mind. He hadn't been in the kitchen that morning. He hadn't even noticed if it had been like that when he left. Michael stood still for a moment, the uneasy feeling settling in the pit of his stomach. His gaze swept over the room, his eyes lingering on the items that had been moved. Nothing had been taken, nothing significant had been disturbed. But it wasn't about the objects themselves, it was about the feeling of being watched. It was as though someone had come into his life and was quietly living in it without him knowing. The more he thought about it, the more the thought took root. Someone was getting into his apartment. It wasn't just his imagination, and it wasn't just a coincidence. The little changes, the missing keys, the displaced objects were all part of something bigger. Something he couldn't yet see clearly, but that was starting to piece itself together in his mind. The realization hit him hard. It wasn't just about misplaced items anymore. It was about invasion. His privacy was being violated in a way he had never imagined. He could no longer deny it. Someone had been in his apartment, and they had been there for a while. But the question that loomed over him now was who? Who had been in his space without his permission? And how long had this been going on? Michael stood in the living room, the quiet stillness around him now oppressive, his mind racing with possibilities. He didn't know who was responsible or why they were doing it. But he knew one thing for certain. The safety and privacy he had once felt in his apartment were gone. This place, which had always been a refuge, was now a source of constant anxiety. And as he stood there, staring at the small, seemingly insignificant marks on the counter, he realized that things would never be the same again. It was time to find out who was breaking into his apartment, and he needed to do it before the intruder made their next move. Michael sat at his desk staring at the screen of his laptop, the glowing light from the monitor casting a pale reflection in the window across the room. It was a familiar scene late at night, his mind preoccupied with work, but tonight it was different. There was a gnawing feeling in his gut that he couldn't shake. The realization that someone had been in his apartment, moving his things, had unsettled him deeply. It wasn't just the small items that had been out of place. It was the violation of his personal space. It was the idea that someone had been walking through his home without his permission, watching him without his knowledge. He ran his fingers through his hair, trying to calm his racing thoughts. The camera. It was the only way to find out what was really happening. He had been hesitant at first, unsure if his suspicions were justified, but now there was no question. In his mind, someone was breaking into his apartment. It wasn't a matter of if anymore, it was when and who. Michael knew he needed to get concrete proof, and that's when the idea hit him. A camera. Not just any camera, but one hidden in plain sight, tucked away in a place where no one would think to look. He had always been meticulous, and he knew that if he was going to do this, he needed to be careful. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. He had to make sure that whatever he captured was clear, undetectable. And so, he came up with the perfect plan. He had an old bathroom mirror hanging on the wall, a simple rectangular piece that he never really gave much thought to. It was large, taking up a good portion of the wall space, and though it was practical, it was also an item that people never questioned. Who would suspect a camera behind the mirror? The idea seemed simple enough. Michael decided to buy a small, discreet hidden camera, something small enough to fit behind the mirror without being detected. He carefully researched online, choosing one that was small, with a wide-angle lens that could capture every corner of the room. It was easy to install. All he needed to do was remove the mirror from the wall, find the perfect spot to attach the camera, and then replace it. Once everything was in place, the camera would be completely hidden. No one would ever suspect it. The next morning, Michael went to the store and bought the camera. He was careful not to raise any suspicion as he made his way through the aisles, picking up the necessary supplies. He even bought a few other things, a new toothbrush, some cleaning supplies as if to mask his true intentions. He didn't want anyone to know what he was planning. The thought of someone else finding out, of someone else knowing about his suspicions, made him uncomfortable. It was better this way. He would handle it on his own. When he returned home, he locked the door behind him and immediately began his work. He started by removing the mirror from the wall. It was heavier than he expected, but he managed to get it down without incident. He wiped away the dust from the back of the mirror, then began carefully setting up the camera. He had measured everything precisely the night before, making sure the camera would be perfectly positioned to capture any movement near the door. With the camera securely attached, he placed the mirror back in its spot, making sure it was aligned just right. Everything had to look exactly the same as it had before. The last thing he wanted was for anyone to notice that something was off. Once the mirror was back in place, Michael stepped back and examined his work. The camera was completely hidden. There was no way anyone would know it was there. The only thing left to do now was wait. He set the camera to record in motion-activated mode, so it would only start recording when someone entered the apartment. He checked the settings one last time, then turned off the lights and sat down on the couch, his eyes glued to the screen of his laptop. He didn't expect anything to happen immediately, but he couldn't help feeling a sense of anticipation. For the next few days, Michael went about his life as usual. He kept a close eye on the footage, checking it every night to see if the camera had picked up anything unusual. At first, there was nothing. No movement, no sign that anyone had been in the apartment. He tried to convince himself that maybe he had been wrong. Maybe it was all just his imagination. But then, one evening, as he checked the footage again, he saw something. The footage started at 7:45 p.m., just as the door to his apartment opened. It wasn't the wind or a random passing neighbor, it was someone. Michael's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the figure on the screen. The person was wearing a dark hoodie, their face obscured by the hood. They stepped inside, closing the door behind them with a quiet click. Michael held his breath, his eyes glued to the screen as the figure moved through the apartment. The camera, hidden behind the mirror, captured everything. The figure moved with purpose, glancing around the room before heading toward the kitchen. Michael's pulse quickened. His suspicions were confirmed. Someone was breaking into his apartment. He watched in silence as the figure went through the drawers in the kitchen, not bothering to be careful, rummaging through his things as if they had done it before. They didn't take anything, at least not from the kitchen, but they seemed to be looking for something. The figure moved through the apartment, stopping at the bookshelf, running their fingers along the spines of the books. Then they moved toward the hallway, pausing at the bathroom door. Michael leaned in closer to the screen, his eyes narrowing, as the figure slowly opened the door. They stepped inside, and for a moment, they stood in front of the mirror, their reflection briefly visible in the glass. It was as if they were checking their surroundings before moving on. The camera in the mirror had captured them perfectly, without their knowledge. The figure didn't stay long. After a few minutes, they left the apartment the same way they had come in, quietly closing the door behind them. Michael felt a cold shiver run down his spine as the footage ended. He had seen enough. The intruder was real, and they were coming into his apartment when he wasn't there. The camera had captured everything, every move, every step. But now the question was, who were they? And why were they doing this? Michael sat back in his chair, the weight of the discovery settling on his chest. The quiet, peaceful life he had once known was gone. He wasn't just living in an apartment anymore. He was living in a place where someone else had access to his life, his space, his belongings. And now he had to figure out how to stop it before it happened again. Michael's heart pounded as he stared at the screen of his laptop. The footage from the hidden camera in the mirror was still fresh in his mind, clear, undeniable evidence that someone had been entering his apartment. He had watched the figure move through his space, rummaging through his things with no care or urgency, as if they had done it before, as if they had every right to be there. The footage had confirmed his worst fear. Someone had been inside his home, and now it was time to face the truth. The question of who this person was and why they were doing it could no longer be ignored. The footage played over and over in his mind. The figure had been wearing a dark hoodie, their face obscured by the shadow of the hood. But Michael had caught a glimpse of their posture, the way they moved, the confidence with which they navigated his apartment. It was as though they knew exactly where everything was. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a random break-in, but something much more personal. Whoever this was, they had been watching him for a while. They had known exactly what to do, where to go, and when to strike. The longer he sat there, the more questions filled his mind. Why was this happening? What did they want? Michael had always considered his life to be private, his apartment his sanctuary. But now, it felt like a place of constant surveillance, as if someone were lurking in the shadows, always watching, always waiting. His sanctuary had been violated, and it wasn't just about the things being moved or the items gone missing. It was the sense of being watched, of having no control over his own space. It was the creeping realization that someone else had the power to invade his life without him knowing. Without him being able to stop it. As the hours passed, Michael's thoughts became more frantic. He couldn't wait any longer. He needed to confront this. He needed answers. He needed to know who was behind this, why they were doing it, and what they had planned. The camera had captured everything he needed. The figure had entered his apartment at the same time, moved the same way. It wasn't just a random intruder. It was someone who knew him. Someone close. His mind snapped back to the footage again. He paused it at the moment when the figure was standing in front of the mirror. There was something about the way they moved in that moment that made Michael's blood run cold. It was almost like they were aware of the camera, aware of the reflection. Could it be possible that they knew? Could they have been aware of the hidden camera in the mirror? Michael wasn't sure, but it didn't matter now. He had the evidence. He had to face whoever it was. Without wasting any more time, Michael stood up and grabbed his coat. He needed to confront this head on. The camera had given him the first piece of the puzzle, but now he needed to put it all together. He couldn't just sit here and wait any longer. He needed to know who was doing this. And he had a feeling that the answer was closer than he had ever imagined. He walked out of his apartment, locking the door behind him. He made his way to the hallway and knocked on Sarah's door. She was the neighbor who lived directly across the hall. They had shared polite greetings over the past year, but they weren't friends. Michael had never felt the need to get to know her better. She was just another face in the building, someone he passed by occasionally on his way in or out. But now, as he stood in front of her door, everything felt different. He couldn't ignore the possibility any longer. The figure in the footage, whoever they were, had a familiarity to them, a feeling of recognition that he couldn't place. The door opened slowly, and Sarah appeared in the doorway. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and her eyes looked tired. She gave him a polite smile, but Michael could tell there was something off about her demeanor. Her gaze darted around the hallway, and she shifted her weight uncomfortably as if unsure of what to do. Before she could speak, Michael cut her off, his voice calm but firm. "I know it's you," he said, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. "I've seen the footage." Sarah's face went pale. She opened her mouth as if to speak but closed it quickly. For a moment, there was only silence between them. Michael could see the struggle in her eyes as she searched for the right words, but nothing came. "I don't know what you think you saw," Sarah finally said, her voice quieter now. She stepped back slightly, her hand resting on the doorframe. "But I swear, I haven't been in your apartment." Michael's gaze never wavered. "Don't lie," he said. "I've been watching the footage. I know who it was. You've been in my apartment more than once. You've been taking things, moving. My things. I don't know why, but I need you to tell me the truth. Now?" Sarah didn't move. Her eyes dropped to the floor, her lips pressed tightly together. Michael's anger began to rise, but he held it back. He needed answers, not a confrontation. He had no interest in getting into a shouting match with her, but he needed to understand what had been going on. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she said, her hands trembling. "I was just trying to find something that belonged to me." She hesitated, as though choosing her words carefully. "I wasn't stealing, Michael. I was trying to get something back." Michael's mind raced as he processed her words. "Get something back? What do you mean? What were you looking for?" Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, as if bracing herself for what she was about to say. "It's not what you think," she replied. "I had something of mine that I lost, and I thought maybe you had it. I didn't mean to invade your privacy, but I had to check. I thought maybe you were hiding it from me." The pieces of the puzzle began to shift in Michael's mind, but the more he tried to make sense of it, the less it added up. What could she possibly be looking for? And why had she been coming into his apartment when he wasn't there? Was there more to this than just a lost object? As Sarah continued to speak, Michael's thoughts drifted, piecing together the fragments of the strange behavior he had noticed. He had been so focused on the intrusions, the violations of his space, that he hadn't considered the possibility of someone close to him being the culprit. He had trusted Sarah, even if only as a neighbor. But now everything was called into question. The camera had exposed the truth, but it only raised more questions. The confrontation didn't bring the closure Michael had hoped for, but it gave him something he hadn't had before, a reason. But even as Sarah stood there, apologizing and explaining, Michael knew that the peace he once felt in his apartment was gone. The trust was gone, and in its place was an unsettling question. What had been hidden in his life that had led to this moment? What else had he missed in the quiet, and how long had it been going on? As Sarah stepped back into her apartment, Michael stood frozen in the hallway. He wasn't sure what the next step was, but one thing was clear: this wasn't the end. The answers were only just beginning. The days following the confrontation with Sarah were a blur of uncertainty and introspection. Michael had always prided himself on his ability to maintain control over his life. His apartment had been a sanctuary, a place where he could retreat after long days of work, where the outside world couldn't touch him. But now it felt as though everything had unraveled. The comfort and safety he once found in his space had been replaced by a gnawing unease, a constant reminder that someone had been inside his home without his permission. The trust he had in his surroundings, in the people around him, had been shattered. Sarah's explanation had only raised more questions. She claimed she wasn't stealing, that she had been looking for something that belonged to her, something she believed Michael had unknowingly taken. Michael wasn't sure whether to believe her. Her confession didn't make sense. What could she possibly have been searching for, and why would she go to such lengths to invade his privacy? The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like there was something she wasn't telling him. But as the days dragged on, Michael found himself weighed down by the decision he now faced. He had the answers he needed. Sarah had been the one entering his apartment, moving his things, looking for whatever it was she felt entitled to. He had the footage, the undeniable proof of her intrusion. But now that he knew the truth, the question remained: what was he supposed to do with it? The apartment, once a refuge, now felt cold and empty. Every corner of it reminded him of the violation, the feeling of being watched. He had thought about changing the locks, installing more cameras, making his apartment more secure, but that would only be a temporary solution. He couldn't live like this, constantly looking over his shoulder, always wondering if someone was watching him. He couldn't keep his life in a state of constant surveillance, forever suspicious of the people around him. And then there was Sarah. Despite everything that had happened, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than she had let on. Her behavior had been strange, but she had apologized, seemed genuinely remorseful. She had claimed she wasn't stealing, but Michael wasn't sure if he could trust her. The uncertainty gnawed at him. Could he really just let this go? Could he forgive her and move on, or was this something that couldn't be undone? The decision weighed heavily on him, keeping him up at night, pacing the apartment, running through the scenarios in his head. He could call the police, file a report, press charges. That would be the logical choice. It would put an end to the situation, ensure that Sarah faced the consequences of her actions. But part of him hesitated. Part of him didn't want to escalate things further. He wasn't sure what he would gain from involving the authorities. It wasn't about the things she had moved or the minor intrusions. It was about the betrayal of trust. It was about the way she had violated the boundaries of his home, his private space. On the other hand, Michael could let it go. He could. Move on, wipe the slate clean, and never bring it up again. He could change the locks, throw away the camera footage, and pretend like nothing had happened. He could tell himself that Sarah had learned her lesson, that she was truly sorry, and that he could forgive her. But something deep inside told him that doing nothing wasn't the right choice. If he let this slide, would it happen again? Would he ever feel safe in his own home again? Could he really forget the way things had unfolded, the way his life had been turned upside down by someone he barely knew? As the days passed, Michael found himself at a crossroads. He didn't want to become consumed by anger or fear, but he also didn't want to live in denial. His life had been altered by Sarah's actions, and he couldn't just go back to the way things were. He needed to take control of the situation, but he wasn't sure how. He wasn't sure what the right choice was. He spent more time at home, trying to find a sense of peace, but it was elusive. The apartment felt like a different place now. He no longer felt at ease when he sat on the couch or walked through the rooms. The things that had once given him comfort now seemed tainted. The mirror on the wall, the very object that had revealed the truth, felt like a reminder of the breach in his life, a constant symbol of everything that had gone wrong. He hadn't removed the camera yet. Part of him wondered if he should. Maybe. It was time to move on, to let go of the constant surveillance, to trust again. But every time he thought about it, he hesitated out one evening as he sat on the couch, staring at the television but not really watching. The decision finally came to him. It wasn't a dramatic moment of clarity, but a quiet realization. The right choice wasn't about what would be easiest or what would make the situation disappear. It wasn't about running from the discomfort or pretending it hadn't happened. The right choice was about reclaiming his sense of self, his sense of control. He couldn't erase the past, but he could decide what came next. He didn't need to forgive Sarah for his own peace of mind, and he didn't need to live in constant fear of the unknown. He had the power to take control of his space, his life, his boundaries. The next morning, Michael changed the locks. He took down the hidden camera, carefully erased the footage, and put it in a box, just as he had planned. He didn't need to keep it. He didn't need to keep any of it. He also called Sarah and told her that he didn't want to see her again, that he couldn't trust her, and that she needed to leave him alone. It was a clean break, a choice he had made for his own peace of mind. There was no malice in his voice, just the firm resolution that he couldn't keep living with the weight of what had happened. The following weeks were quieter, the tension lifting just slightly with each passing day. Michael had his privacy back. He didn't feel as though he was living in constant surveillance, waiting for someone to intrude on his space again. He returned to his routine, the hum of his apartment becoming a comfortable background noise once more. The fear of being watched slowly faded, replaced by a sense of control that he had been missing. But every so often, as he passed the mirror on the wall, Michael would catch his reflection and remember the choice he had made. It wasn't easy, but it was the right choice for him. It wasn't about revenge or retribution. It was about taking back what was his and learning to trust again, not in others, but in himself. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was the beginning of something new, something he could build from the pieces of his life that had once felt shattered but were now whole again.